But let's go back to Martin. Martin, we were talking earlier about stories and storytelling, and you well outlined the ability for IBM sales guys to be able to tell a good story. I was actually trained by IBM to tell stories, although, to be honest, I think most of my interest in storytelling has happened since then. And we were talking about the structure of a good story. Do you think you could go into that in a bit more detail in terms of perhaps some of the history and what makes a good story?
Okay. Imagine yourself in a toga, in a nice warm environment, a few olive trees around you. You're 2,500 years ago, listening to Aristotle. That's where the art of storytelling first started to get encoded. And you know what Aristotle did 2,500 years ago is still very relevant today. Even all the work that was done through the last 100 years or so in Hollywood and in universities around what is literature still very much resonates with that early idea of what is a good story. And about the only part that I don't use from what Aristotle wrote down was music. Because a good story, in the way they put a play together, has the music that goes with it. I keep trying to work it in, but it never goes down well with the senior teams when you start playing the tune. And I can't sing either. So we're not even going to go down that route as a starting point. But the first thing you want to understand is the structure of a story. There is a structure to it. There is a structure we're all used to in stories. And that structure starts by, first of all, having some understanding of what the initial situation is. Something happens then in that initial situation, an incident that causes the hero in our story to begin their journey. And usually what you find is the hero reacts to that incident. The tension rises until it looks like the hero's got everything sorted out. Tension drops away again. That's what we call false hope. That's the bit when all of a sudden you think, uh-oh, it's not as good as we thought it was going to be. Now the hero really has to respond. And step by step, the whole tension in the story builds up until you get to the final conflict, and then it's resolved. That's an arc. Quickly use this flip chart here, and I hope I don't mess up our cameraman completely. But in a timeline, as it comes out here, if that's the tension, that's your initiation. There's no tension in the story. You learn about the characters. The incident happens, rises, falls, rises, final conflict, and then the new normal at the end. That's the structure of a story. For those that were here this morning that saw my session, I did exactly that as I talked about the last year in Cambridge assessment, and everything was going really well for the first 6 months. And then the biggest project we'd ever seen came in and broke us, and then how we had to recover from that. So you've got the structure of story. The other thing a story needs are characters. You don't need a lot of characters, but you need two key ones. The ones that are vying for the opposite extremes of the story. You could call them protagonist and antagonist, but I prefer to call them hero and villain. Because hero and villain also has something emotive to it. Stories have emotions in there. And the shortest stories in the world have a lot of emotion, and they rely on you to fill a lot of the details in. You don't have to tell everything in a story. Hemingway has one of the shortest stories in the world. Yeah? Do you want to hear this one? If I can get it right now. Baby shoes, for sale, never used. That has all sorts of emotive context that you can start filling in around it. Okay, you're not quite sure who the characters are in that one, but straight out, in those 6 words, he can catch a lot of emotion with people straight out. You imagine things. So when you tell a good story, you have to tell just enough for your audience to relate to it. It's got to be meaningful to them. If the story's not meaningful and they don't relate to it, it's really not going to hit the mark. So you might vary the way in which you tell the story according to the audience. That story I first used works well with people who've been around that loop of trying to do architecture and then not getting it through. But I would use a totally different story as an icebreaker of what is storytelling with different audiences. So you get your characters. Well, those characters have to have something important. Conflict. You need to have conflict sitting in a story. But does this process work over and over again? Who remembers the A-Team? I'm trying to pick the age of the audience here to work it through. I'm going to have to go back a bit further, perhaps, John, but you've probably seen the A-Team, yeah? Right. How many series was the A-Team? 7, 8 series of the same thing over and over again? Nobody ever died, because not at that point in time. We weren't to modern standards of blood and guts and all the rest. But the story kicks out every week with the same sort of level. There's some initiating event. The young lady turns up, meets Hannibal in drag in a bar, something like that. Point of initiation, her father's being run off the farm. Can he help? Sure. Let's get BA drugged up, shove him on the plane, something like that. So there's a little comedy element to it. We turn up, the A-team comes on in, it's the mayor of the town is trying to drive her father off the land. They explain the situation to him, it's all looking good, he's going to back down because BA is obviously too big to worry. You're not going to argue with him, are you?
I love it when a good plan comes together.
Yep, and that's the point. You think it's all going to go smoothly, but you also know you're only 17 minutes into the show. What you're going to do for the other 30 minutes. And that's the point where you find out the mayor's actually got the Russian mob working for him, and the guys come round the corner with the Kalashnikovs. The A-team has to leg it. They're in the barn now with oxyacetylene torches and 2 spare tractors, make the van up into something that cannot get itself broken apart when it flies through the air, comes flying out, there's various fisticuffs, a final chase. Over and over again with extra twists. We're going up and down that arc until at the end they get away just in time. That's it. That's the story. But people kept watching it. It's the same thing in CSI. If you watch all the different variants of CSI, it's a process that has become quite formulaic in Hollywood. And if you're going to tell a story, stick to a standard timeline. Unless you're Quentin Tarantino, and you can get away with that, messing it all up and interposing the bits around the scenes, stick to a standard storyline. But those are the key things. A structure, characters, conflict, and make it something that people can relate to.
Great, thank you. My hero, if you like, in the context of this is Joseph Campbell and his great, well, more than book, films and everything else, Hero with 1,000 Faces. He was a sort of New York Catholic and came from Ireland and went back in history looking at all the stories in history and came up with, you know, this formula. I mean, other people had sort of related to it. And George Lucas actually wrote a lot of Star Wars, well, the whole Star Wars theme on the back of it. So it's a timeless shape that actually is not difficult to tune into. And if we're into this whole area of selling our story, yeah, as enterprise architects, it's worth practicing, because without it, you get beaten by IBM, the villain.
Certainly does. And they're not always the villain. Most of the time, perhaps, I don't know. But the villain is always something that wants something different to the hero. And that very often is the conflict that we find in organisations, the internal view to the external view, what the vendor's architecture is compared to the architecture that the internal team are trying to put together. And it's not malicious. Everybody's in it for the right reasons, to make more money for their own organisations, to further their organisation's intent. But there are different patterns in stories as well. You might have a story that is real drama with tragedy in there. That was the Greek style, tragedy. You might have a story that is the rags to riches, and everything fails, but then you grow back to the riches afterwards. There's detective stories, science fiction, there's genres and themes that you can put to them. You just want to make sure you got the right one. You don't want to start telling your organisation's story for the future as a tragedy or a comedy. But sometimes it's right to get the right mix there to engage the audience. And it's just thinking about what are the steps you're going through and use some of the formula to actually put the information you've got. And also remember where you are in the story. In most stories, the incident that kicks the story off has already happened. Whenever you're telling it, it's usually happened. You're usually not the guy sitting there today saying, I bet you didn't know this, but... And from that point on, you change the world and the story flows through, and you're going to tell them what the future looks like. Usually, it's happened, you're at some point along the way, and now you're going to help the rest of the audience feel what the rest of the story is going to look like. Give them an idea of where they're going. Who's bought a car? Been to the car salesman? Yeah? They're telling you a story when they do that. They get you to sit in the car, experience what it's going to be like in the future. It's the same sort of thing. They're getting you to appreciate what the future is going to look like, and you buy into it. When you tell a story and do it the right way, you're getting the audience to buy into that future vision that you're giving them. Future vision? Sound reasonable to architects? Yeah? The story is just the change from where you are today to where you want to be.
Great, thank you, Martin. So let's take that idea of this story and this villain being on the outside and the hero being on the inside. How does that translate to systems thinking? Because within a system, you have a boundary, don't you? You have a scope, yeah? Talk to us a bit about that boundary around systems thinking and how that relates to EA.
Well, basically, my sort of take on systems thinking is very much inspired by this VSM, as I mentioned. So that's basically any organization consists of a number of systems, and there are boundaries between these systems, and that's the whole thing. It's the connections between, it's not each of the systems, that's a management system, operations, and so on. But it's the boundaries between them and the interrelationship. And that's the hard thing for people to understand, really. But once they get it, I remember Patrick Hoverstadt saying that it's like in, and now I don't remember, in the Matrix you have the red pill and the blue pill, I can't remember which one, but it's the one where when you take the pill it changes the worldview. And that's system thinking, basically. So it changes the way you understand the world around you and the boundaries between all the elements of whatever system you're looking at. So it's basically an analytic skill you get when you start to understand system thinking. And essentially you can explain a lot of well, maybe everything, that might be too much, but at least organizations and how organizations work and evolve and interrelate with their environment. So it's a core skill for enterprise architects. And this is about boundary objects. That's the interesting thing. It's not sort of just boundaries that there's a door there and so there's a boundary and so on. It's the boundary objects that are interesting for architects. Basically all the artifacts and models and systems and so on we create are boundary objects. So they have they are perceived differently by different actors and it's at different levels. So it can be purely syntactic, that if I say something in Danish you wouldn't understand me because you don't understand this particular syntax. It could be the semantics well, the way we understand certain words and concepts and events depends on our cultural heritage and our background and our training and so on. And they can be pragmatic in terms of sort of the politics and we have different sub-agendas and super-agendas and all this. So it's all about understanding boundary objects and the boundaries are basically the relations between all these are what makes up system thinking. And when we apply it in EA, it's exactly what we are doing, that oh yes, some systems or whatever, if it's application portfolio management type of EA, it's sort of what are the actual functionalities of these systems. They might be called something different and have different ownerships, but they do the same. So that's where we understand the systemic relations between all these and what we apply as architects. And maybe also why we are oftentimes misunderstood, because, well, some would say we can see stuff others can't see, or at least we understand things differently from others who sit more in their silo, and we see more across all the silos and the different events and the stories and the cultures and so on. So that's basically how system thinking is related to it. If I can add on storytelling, because I hope it's not just coincidental that here's Martin talking about storytelling and me talking about system thinking. I think it really goes together. All the stories, you need to understand what kind of audience, and you can tell certain stories to certain audiences and so on. That's key competency for architects. And just an example, when we, in the Danish government, launched the national EA program, we did call it EA, even though a lot of people, they had really hard time understanding what the hell is this enterprise architecture. And it translates badly into Danish, so the word enterprise is too complex in English language to really translate into Danish. So we were really looking for, well, how can we explain this? Even name it, we still haven't really found out. So it's sort of English, Danish, Danglish, or whatever when we talk about EA in Danish. But when we launched it, I was sort of thinking of my background in urban planning. And I mean, as a civil servant, you try out stuff on whatever department heads and ministers and all these kinds of people. And it was very clear we couldn't just talk about enterprise architecture and get the minister to understand. There was a story about this particular minister in the early 2000s who was a sports maniac. And there was one of his former department heads who left and started becoming an author. So he wrote a book about a fictional ministry in a fictional country and a fictional minister or secretary it would be, or whatever minister is here in England, right? And this minister, he loved sports, so this young head of office who needed to sell a program to this minister, he used all kinds of sports metaphors that it would be very uphill and you would take the yellow jersey or all that sort of stuff. It was a fiction, it was a novel he wrote, but it was really true. So when I was sitting there and we launched this program, I thought, well, how can we tell a story about what EA is really about? And I went back to my urban planning thinking, because I thought this is just urban planning for huge IT and small IT in government. Urban planning is very much about all the layers of architecture in the city, the sewage system and electricity and traffic and zoning and so on. So it's all enterprise architecture, or EA is all urban planning in some sense. So we chose, when we launched a white paper, I wrote a chapter on the digital urban planning for government systems and government services. And the minister there, he wasn't that stupid actually. He loved sport, but I thought that was cheesy. But he got this story, so I thought, okay, if that guy gets the thinking that EA is really about urban planning, he can relate to, you need planning to have a well-functioning city. So you need enterprise architecture, apparently, to run efficient IT and modernize government services. So we actually used a bit of storytelling in that sense. And 3 years after, Gartner stole the idea of city planning as IT planning. And a guy from Microsoft also stole, I don't know if he stole the idea or just came up with it himself. But that's sort of where I'm sort of based on system thinking. It's all about the relations and what EA is about, and storytelling, and get this message across. It worked.
Another of my great heroes is Sir Patrick Geddes. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was an Edinburgh guy back in the Victorian era, and he basically invented town planning in the area of the Victorian slums. Yeah. And then went on to do some fantastic sort of town planning in Edinburgh and other parts of the world, Dublin and even in India. And it's interesting how we do like to draw analogies back to the physical. You know, a lot of this stuff's so abstract, it's actually quite difficult to bring it to life, even as a story, when we're talking of such abstract ideas. But thank you for telling a story. I mean, maybe we can flip it back again, because there's this aspect now of letting Martin talk a bit about systems thinking. And let's take this idea of the hero and the villain, because I have a hypothesis that, you know, perhaps 10, 20 years ago, the hero was the internal organisation, and the villain was the IBM or something on the external. But there's been something of a flip recently with this sort of third idea of design thinking, where we're actually looking at the customer being the hero, and that the organisation and IT often being the villain. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah.
And do you have a good story about it?
Reaching deep into my bag of stories, but first of all, let me put it into context. You've got all sorts of different heroes and villains. It depends very much on the context you want to tell. If I'm telling a story to you, I want you to feel like you're potentially the hero in the story as well. You've got to be able to relate to the hero's plight. You want to be the one that's championing the hero coming along. The last place I want to be in the story is the actual hero of the story. Because that way, if I'm trying to get you to change, and I'm the hero in the story, well, you just look at me and say, well, go do it then. Off you go. Usually when you're telling a story to a group of people and you want them to do something, you want them to consider themselves to be the heroes. And that they can actually stand up against the villain in a suitable fashion that has a chance of winning. Not just going to be easy. There may be a struggle involved. So when you look at this and say, what's the hero and the villain? It all depends what pitch you're trying to make. So if you're trying to make a pitch that you want to be going to the cloud rather than internal, then the villain is going to be around the reasons why staying internal is a bad idea and going to the cloud is a good idea. The benefits to the organisation that relate potentially directly back to the person you're telling the story for. It may not be easy to go to the cloud. It may mean that we're going to have to make lots of changes in the way we do software development, manage our infrastructure, look at the cost model. But fundamentally, it may make our organisation far more agile, responsive to disruptive threats. So you build the benefits and the reasons why into the story in such a way that people say, yeah, I can champion that. And when you take them on the journey, the challenge, what they're fighting is potentially decades worth of investment in the organisation that's never paid off properly, an infrastructure that currently can't scale, an inability to change. You can build that to be the villain. Perhaps you don't want to do that if you've got the CIO sat at the side of you who's been responsible for building that over the years. Just as the challenge of getting a good business case through, the CFO should never be the villain. It should be always something else in your organisation, because the CFO is never going to let you get another thing through if you're painting the story that they're the villain in some way. You need to get them on side. So hero and villain changes very much in the context and what you're trying to tell. But the message I give you is always think about who the hero and the villain is. Don't just wander blindly into the woods and hope you're going to tell a story to get you back out again and make it up. You start with the plan that clearly sets people with the understanding. I want to be on the hero's side. This is what the hero's rooting for. The villain, this is what they're rooting for. They've got different perspectives on the problem, different ideas of what the outcome should be, both equally valid. If you make the hero too strong and the villain's not worth challenging, you're not really going to get their attention. The hero's got to have a pretty just cause, good reason, and the villain often would look like they're almost unbeatable in the situation. And that's where the story actually helps people think about, I'm going to take that conflict on. Together we can make it win. So it really doesn't matter whether it's internal or external that's the villain. In fact, one of the best villains you can have is because that's the way we've always done it.